everybody. Welcome to MoneyTalks. I'm Rosie.
And I'm Eric.
And today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Greg MaGee, Associate Professor of Biblical Studies here at Taylor University.
He'll be talking to us about the theology of money.
Enjoy.
How you manage your money will present you with lots of risks and opportunities. So we're going to cover theology of money today to try to prepare you for that and get you ready for that experience. So three main ideas we're going to focus on are 1, undivided loyalty, 2, wise stewardship, and 3, generous giving. So let's start with undivided loyalty, which I think is really at the core of what we need to know for a good theology of money. So whether it's in the Old Testament with the 10 Commandments and the command to have no other gods before God, or whether it's in the 10 Commandments also the prohibitions against idolatry, or when Jesus' own teachings, when he talks about not storing up our treasures on earth but in heaven instead, and not serving two masters, that we can't serve both God and money. The issue of undivided loyalty comes up. And then the apostles even later talk about the dangers of the love of money, that it's the root of all kinds of evil and that it has caused some to wander from the faith. And so the issue of loyalty is a key one. And money, and the way we use money, tends to express what our true loyalties are. So it can be a good barometer of where our loyalties lie. But it can also help us grow in the process of discipleship as we learn to train ourselves to have more loyalty towards God and His kingdom and less loyalty towards the fleeting things of this earth. So having an undivided loyalty is essential. And a lot of the challenge with undivided loyalties is at the heart level. Jesus says, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And so I think great theologians like Jonathan Edwards have talked about this. It's the issue of the affections. We have to be careful to feed our right affections towards God and be on guard against wrong affections towards other things. So we want to feed our affections in the direction of love for God through prayer, through Bible study, participation in worship, in service. But I also think we have to be on the lookout for things that are drawing our affections elsewhere. And money has that power to draw our affections away from God to lesser things. And I think that that's true no matter what your personality type is. So some of us are more naturally spenders and others are more naturally savers. But for both of those groups, money can become an idol. And there are things that feed that idol if we're not careful. So for spenders, advertisers tend to feed that appetite, that we just have to have more stuff in order to have a fulfilling life, in order to feel like we're keeping up with those around us. Advertisers create that sense that we're lacking something in the good life. And they often tie that good life to having more stuff or to having expensive experiences. And they create an appetite in us that gives us more of an affection for money and the things that it buys and less of an affection for God. But then savers have that same danger as well, just in a different direction. We can make an idol out of saving if we're not careful. Think about the rich young fool in Luke chapter 12 who builds up these barns to store all of his grain, thinking that that will give him security in life so that he can then take it easy. And then Jesus says, you fool, this very night, your life will be required from you. And so whether you're a spender or a saver, there's a danger that the idol of money and what it can provide will draw our affections away from God and towards these things that ultimately won't satisfy. So this issue of who has your heart has to be the first thing you determine, and really the thing you continue to go back to as you think about money, because money has that unique ability to draw our affections away from God to other things. Well, the second area I want to talk about today is wise stewardship. Wise stewardship. This is an important aspect of a theology of money because it recognizes that in the end, God owns it all. He is the one, according to Genesis 1, who's created this whole world. He's the king of this kingdom that He has created. Now, Genesis 1 says that He created us in His image to carry out His desires for this created world. And so that's where the idea of stewardship comes in, that we are tasked with this responsibility of being stewards of all the good gifts and resources that God has blessed us with in this world. And so as we recognize that He owns things and that we don't own the things that we think we own, it allows us to change our mindset about how we use our money. It helps us to buy into more of an eternal perspective in the way we use our money. But also it brings in this issue of wisdom, which is a very important biblical concept, just the ability to live our lives wisely with God in mind, but with long-term good things in mind as well. So for instance, the book of Proverbs talks a lot about how to live life wisely. And some of that wisdom is applied directly to the area of money. So in issues such as working hard and diligently while you're young and while you still can work. The value of consistent plotting when it comes to work and saving and just doing a little bit at a time, that can make a big difference. And also just the benefits of planning for the future. So Proverbs talks about all sorts of things related to wise stewardship when it comes to our money. But we don't have to look only to the Bible to gain wisdom as a Christian. The Bible also encourages us to learn wisdom from experience. From our own experience of learning from our mistakes when it comes to the area of money, but also learning from those who are wiser than we are and learning from their mistakes, but also learning from the lessons that they have gleaned in their own use of money. And so here are just a few things I want to share, 4 practical areas of wise stewardship that I have learned about in past years. And the first issue, the first idea is that you want to know where your money is actually going when you're spending it and when you're using it. And sometimes that can be surprising, but we won't be surprised and we won't learn anything about how we're using money unless we actually are keeping track of how we're using our money in the first place. So whether it's a formal budget or whether you're just observing the expenses that you've paid through your credit card or from your checking account, you want to have some idea of where your money's going. And you might be surprised that it's going, a lot more is going to eating out than you thought, or maybe to expensive and tasty coffees or other things that tend to take up more of our money than we realize. We won't learn from our experiences if we don't know where that money's going in the first place. So have some type of record-keeping system that will allow you to know where your money's going. The second practical tip I would give, and it's especially helpful as it relates to homes and cars, and that is start small and then build up when it comes to those purchases. So for instance, cars. I'll argue in a minute that you should try to avoid debt if at all possible, especially for something like a car or other things that don't have kind of a permanent value in your life. So I would recommend trying to start out small with a car. So save up just enough to buy yourself a used car to start with. And then as you use that car, begin saving up to buy another car in the future so that you don't have to go into debt and so that you're not overextending yourself on something that's nicer and newer than what you really need early on. Eventually you can build up to more reliable or newer cars, but you want to do that slowly and carefully. You don't have to have it all right when you get out of college. But this is especially important when it comes to buying a home. I have found that this is the single biggest mistake, and perhaps the most common mistake I see from younger believers and even people my own age, is that they buy a house that's really more than they can afford, and it gets them into a financial fix that's hard to get out of. My wife and I rented for many years. We didn't buy our first house until we were in our early 30s. Some people say you never want to rent because you're not building into your long-term equity, but we found that renting was the wise thing for us. It allowed us to have flexibility to move from place to place quite easily when we were young. It also allowed us not to overextend ourselves and again get ourselves into a bind financially. And then when we finally did buy a home, we tried to buy a home that was well within our budget. Now here's a tricky thing about buying a home. The mortgage company will approve you for a mortgage, and they will say you can afford this much, or you are approved for this much to buy a house. I would warn you don't take that as your budget. You should actually determine what you can afford apart from what the bank says you can afford. And my wife and I have never gone for what the bank says we can afford and what we've been approved for, but we always look at our situation. We've tried to aim much lower so that we're not, again, getting in a difficult situation that we won't be able to recover from in the future. So I would also recommend trying to get put 20% down for a down payment. I know that's more than what you'll hear from other people, but I do think that that's just part of wise stewardship, to just make sure you're not overexposing yourself to risk. And so I would recommend buying small, and then eventually, if you have a family and your needs grow and you need more space and other things, maybe you can make that your second home at a time when you are more established financially. But don't try to go for too much of a home too early. I think that can really come back to bite you. The third practical area of advice is related to that, and that is beyond schooling and housing. I would try to avoid any type of debt. And you might be thinking, that's just unrealistic in this day and age and how tight the economy is. But if it's at all possible, try to avoid debt for things that depreciate and won't have value over the long haul. And that's where schooling and housing can be an exception, because those do provide long-term value. But even then, I think it's even helpful to have an aggressive plan to try to pay yourself out of that debt as soon as possible. In a sense, once you get out of debt, you're getting ahead of the curve, and you're allowing yourself to then save for future needs so that you won't have to go into debt for those future purchases. So an aggressive plan against debt is something that I would advise as well. Then finally, you do want to plan for two types of needs: unexpected needs and then long-term needs. So an emergency fund is a great idea for unexpected needs, so that you won't have to go into debt if you have a need that you weren't planning on. So building up an emergency fund, people talk about making the goal 3 to 6 months worth of salary or expenses. That can really be helpful when those car or even home needs come up that you weren't expecting, or perhaps some health needs. It's really nice to have something put away for unexpected needs. Insurance certainly comes in this area as well. Having insurance to cover for the unexpected is important as well. And then for long-term needs, I think it is wise to plan for retirement. Now, I'm not one who would advocate that once you get to a certain age, you should just kick back and live life on the beach and resorts or playing golf all your life. I don't think that's a biblical way of doing things. I think we should seek to be productive and fruitful for the Lord throughout our lives. But there is a reality that as we get older, we may not have that same earning power as we did when we were younger because of health or other responsibilities. And so it is wise for people to plan for the long-term future by putting away money from an early point towards retirement, to be able to plan for that time when you won't have as many resources coming in as you did when you were younger. Well, that is wise stewardship. Let's move to the final major point of theology, and that is the biblical call to be a generous giver, and just to have a basic attitude and perspective of generosity. Let me read to you a verse from 1 Timothy 6, 18 through 19, which I think puts it well. Command the rich to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. You hear echoes of Jesus' teachings about laying up treasures in heaven here, but I love that last line of taking hold of life that is truly life. It comes back to that idea of undivided loyalties. It is worth it, placing our anchor in eternal things of God that really will last. And generous giving can allow us to tap in more to that eternal, some of those eternal blessings that won't be realized now, but will be a source of great joy one day in the future. So 3 ideas for generous giving. First, give regularly, and then second, give broadly, and third, give anonymously. So let me talk about giving regularly first. I do believe that biblically a priority in giving is giving to God's work, especially through the local church. And the Bible talks about trying to get in a habit of giving the best and the first of our income to the Lord and His work. 2 Corinthians 9:7 talks about deciding beforehand what you want to give so that you can have a plan to give, develop a habit to give even. That shouldn't be under compulsion, but that should be done cheerfully. And that's a great habit to develop. My wife and I developed this habit a number of years ago, trying to make that giving a regular part of our worship. And so we decided, instead of just giving every month or so, that we would actually divide things up to give every week so that we could incorporate giving to God's work in the church as a part of our regular worship, and seeing it even as a part of worshiping and honoring God. And that's been a lot of fun to understand that giving is not about me just checking off a box, and giving isn't just about meeting needs, but giving is an act of worship. When we're generous with our resources, it is an act of worship to God. And so I would encourage you to cultivate that habit. And the best way to start any habit is to start now, not to wait until everything is lined up for you. And so even if you don't feel like you have anything to give now, look for creative ways to begin giving to God's work even now, so that you can develop a habit that you can carry with you once you do have more resources to give. My college friend Ann was a great model of this. She got some graduation money when she graduated from college, and she immediately turned that around and gave that to some of her friends who were doing summer mission work that summer. And I always thought that was a great idea of starting immediately. So whether it's a summer job or whether it's even work that you're doing here at school, don't wait for just the perfect time to give. Begin giving now so that it can become a regular part of your life and your worship. Secondly, give broadly. So this was a mistake I think that I made early on in my life as an adult, is to limit giving to God's work in the church. I think that is the priority. But the Bible talks about generosity more generally as well, that we should, as Christians, should be people of generosity in all areas of life, that generosity should spill over to the way we view people and just to our practices in daily life. And so giving broadly could mean something as simple as tipping well, or being nice to the kid that comes by, or the neighborhood kid that comes by and is asking you to donate to a cause, or looking for creative ways to give to programs that help the needy and the poor in your neighborhood and in your community. So give broadly, don't limit it to giving to God's work through the church, which I do think we're commanded to do, but also think about how giving can become a lifestyle in all areas of life. And then finally, look for ways to give anonymously. Jesus does talk about the motive for giving, that can be corrupted if we're not careful. In Matthew 6:1-4, talks about being careful not to give for an earthly reward, for applause of others, and such things, but that we should be looking to give with an eternal reward in mind, with the idea of honoring God as our first priority. And one way to do that is to look for ways to give secretly, so that it really is only God that you are seeking to please in that gift. And so that can be a real sense of joy, especially as you realize that people are benefiting from that and they don't have any obligation to thank you for it, but that it was a gift that God had given you originally, and you were simply a steward of it, and so you're giving anonymously or secretly just to be, in a sense, a vessel of God's generosity to you, to others. Well, I hope that some of those brief snippets of theology and some of those practical ideas will be helpful for you. I certainly pray that you will find lots of joy and lots of growth in the area of giving and use of money and allegiance to God as you move on from Taylor out into the broader world. So thanks for this time together.